Hey guys, how's it going? Today I'll show you how to kill spiritual creatures, but before I start this video, if you're looking for more Slayer guides like this one, please check out the description box below for a full list of all the guides that I've posted thus far. Thanks and enjoy the rest of the video. So here are the timestamps for the video, and I've broken up this guide into 4 different sections. The first section will go over the requirements and recommendations, and this section will specifically talk about quest and stat requirements for killing spiritual creatures. The second part of the guide will go over all the important information needed to understand what spiritual creatures are and how the dungeon mechanics work. The third section will go over how to select your armor depending on the location and the combat style you want to use. And in the last section, we will go over each location, including how to run there from different starting points, what your inventory and quick pairs will look like, and I'll also provide you with an in-game example of how I would kill spiritual creatures. So let's quickly go over the requirements and recommendations. Firstly, to access the God Wars dungeon, you must have at least partially completed the Troll Stronghold quest up to the point where you have killed the NPC dad so you have access to the Trollheim area. The second requirement to access any of the God Wars dungeons is 60 agility or 60 strength. The third requirement is that each type of spiritual creature requires a different Slayer level, so in order to damage the spiritual rangers, you'll need to have 63 Slayer, 68 Slayer for spiritual warriors, and 83 Slayer for spiritual mages, and you are allowed to use wild pies to give yourself a +5 Slayer level boost. For recommendations, the completion of the Edgar's Ruse quest will unlock the Trollheim teleport, which will save you a lot of time running to the God Wars dungeon. The other recommendation is to complete the Making Friends with My Arm quest, and this will help to unlock the fire pit, which is located right next to the God Wars dungeon. By lighting this fire pit, it will stop the stat draining effect experienced in extremely cold areas. If you'd like to read more about the God Wars dungeon or the different quests that I've just highlighted, you can find all the Wikipedia links in the description box below. So now let's just quickly go over the important information for spiritual creatures. Spiritual creatures are broken up into 3 different categories. There are spiritual rangers, spiritual warriors, and spiritual mages, and killing any of these 3 will count towards a spiritual creature slayer task. Now, you'll see that each of these 3 spiritual creatures have 4 different god versions which you can kill, including one for Zamrock, Saradomin, Bandos, and Armadil. All 4 gods have very similar combat stats, so it's not like one is harder to kill than another. The only difference between the 4 is that each god is located in different parts of the God Wars dungeon, and different parts of the dungeon requires different god protection. We'll discuss more about god protection in the armor section of this tutorial. Now going over the combat info, spiritual creatures combat levels will range from somewhere between 115 to 134 depending on which spiritual creature and god you decide to kill. They have a max hit between 16 and 20 and their hits are fairly accurate. They will be aggressive onto you unless you wear the correct god affiliate item, and we will discuss more about how to make them unaggressive in the armor section. Also, you can see that each spiritual creature only has one attack style, so the spiritual rangers will only use ranged, the warriors will only use melee, the mages will only use magic, so using protection prayers will allow you to take no damage whatsoever for the Slayer task. Now going down to the Slayer info, and like we already mentioned before, the spiritual rangers will require level 63 Slayer, warriors will require level 68 Slayer, and mages will require level 83 Slayer. For each spiritual creature, I've also listed the best spots for where you can kill them. There are certain areas in the God Wars dungeon that not only have larger clusters of the spiritual creature you are looking for, but also require less god protection armor to render all of the monsters in that area unaggressive, resulting in an increase of efficiency for your Slayer task. However, each of the 5 areas of the God Wars dungeon have different stat and item requirements to enter, so make sure that whichever area you decide to use, that you also have those requirements fulfilled. The last thing on the chart is recommended armor setups, and you can see that I've ranked them by my overall preference, but if your account is geared towards a particular combat style, you may want to opt for the second or third option, which are still very effective attack styles. So wrapping up this section, the 3 things you should definitely remember heading into the armor charts is which spiritual creature you're going to kill, and this is primarily based off of your Slayer level, which best spot you will use, while also making sure that you have those stat and item requirements fulfilled to use that spot, and also which recommended armor setup you will use. If you need to, I highly suggest that you pause the video now to write those things down. You'll also notice that I haven't really talked about the Wilderness God Wars dungeon in this section, mostly because killing them in the wilderness is quite straightforward as there's only one large room versus the 5 rooms of the God Wars dungeon. For those people looking to use the wilderness dungeon, we will talk more about it in the armor section as well as in the location information section of this guide. We're now moving on to the armor selection, and here are the timestamps for each location if you want to skip forward. We'll start off with the God Wars dungeon, and there are 2 parts to this section. Firstly, all of the armor chart links are in the description box below. I suggest that you go there now to pull up your desired armor chart and have it open in a separate tab. So you can pause the video to do that, but once you have your armor chart open, you can then listen to my explanation on how to use these charts, and remember that this explanation applies to all of the charts I've listed on screen, so let's go ahead and begin. Alright, so for this explanation, I'll be using the melee prayer chart as the example, but like I said before, this explanation can apply to any of the other armor charts that I've shown previously. So there's obviously a lot of stuff going on with these charts, but simply put, the best in slot items are located on the left hand side, while the right side consists of almost every god item that you can find in the game that will provide you with god protection. Don't worry too much about what I just said because I'm gonna pull up these two important images here, and I want to redirect your focus to the protection required chart on the left hand side. You can see that there are a total of 5 areas inside the God Wars dungeon, and each area requires you to wear different god protection items to render all of the monsters in that area unaggressive. By now, you should already know which area you will be in as we discussed this in the information section. So what you want to do is to simply look at your area and all of the ones highlighted in green and say yes for your area. Write down those gods that you will need protection from now, as we will need it for building our armor setup in the next slide. Alright, so you should have those gods written down, and we're going to switch back to the example armor chart here. If I were to use this chart, my strategy would be to prioritize building the best armor setup that I can first, and you can do this by choosing the top options for each armor category, whether it's for the helmet slot, the necklace slot, the body slot, etc. After I've built my armor setup, I would then try to focus on incorporating the god item or god items that are required for my area. I've color coded the chart so you can see which best in slot items also provide god protection, so text highlighted in blue stands for Saradomin, red stands for Zamorak, gray for Bandos, and yellow for Armadillo. I suggest that you pause the video now to build your armor setup before we continue on to the next slide. Alright, so your armor setup should now be complete with all the necessary god items needed for your area. We're now going to switch back to these two images, and I want to redirect your focus to the dungeon map on the right hand side. The one thing you'll notice with this dungeon map is that the entrance to the God Wars dungeon is actually located in the main dungeon, and in the main dungeon, as seen in the protection required chart, you need all 4 god pieces equipped at the same time to make all of the monsters unaggressive in that area. For the people whose best spot for killing spiritual creatures is the main dungeon, your armor setup that you have built should already have all 4 god armors equipped, so for those people specifically, you can actually skip forward to the next part of the guide where we go over location information. For the rest of us who are using the other areas, our current armor setups are still missing 2 to 3 god items to give us that full protection in the main dungeon. What we can do is just bring the god armors that we currently are not wearing and have it in our inventory instead, and we can do a quick armor swap right before we enter the dungeon. The reason why doing this is useful is because it allows us to wear the best armor possible in our god area, while also giving us that temporary protection of being in the main dungeon. So all you have to do is just look at the protection required chart and look at the area that you will be in, and all the ones highlighted in red and say no for your area, write those gods down now because we will need this info as we go back to the armor chart. Alright, so you should have those gods that you don't have protection from written down. We're going to switch back to the armor chart here, and I now want to redirect your focus to the god items on the right hand side. So you can see that there are 4 columns to this chart, and each column is organized by the god type. So we have a column for Saradomin, one for Zamorak, one for Bandos, and one for Armadillo. For all of the gods that you don't have protection from, you will need to choose one item in that column and place it in your inventory. Obviously, there's a lot of god items that you can choose from. The items highlighted in white are completely fine to use, but they can be pretty expensive or hard to obtain, especially if you're an Iron Man. So what I did was I highlighted some items in green, and the green items represent god items that are relatively easy to obtain in the game, whether you buy it from the Grand Exchange, get them as a reward from a quest, get them as a drop from a monster, etc. The only thing is, just make sure you don't choose a god item that you're already wearing in your current armor setup, because you need to wear 4 different god items at the same time to make all of the monsters in the main dungeon unaggressive to you. I recommend that you pause the video now and pick the god items that you don't have and place it in your inventory before we continue on to the next section. Alright, we're now going to cover armor for the Wilderness God Wars dungeon, and there are 2 parts to this section. Firstly, all of the armor chart links are in the description box below. I suggest that you go there now to pull up your desired armor chart and have it open in a separate tab. So you can pause the video to do that, but once you have your armor chart open, You can then listen to my explanation on how to use these charts, and remember that this explanation applies to all of the charts I've listed on screen, so let's go ahead and begin. Alright, so for this example, I'll be using the Wilderness Range Prayer chart, and before we even talk about the armor charts, I want to talk a little bit about the Wilderness God Wars dungeon itself, so you have an idea of how the dungeon mechanics work once you're in there. First off, the cave entrance is sort of like a lobby once you get in there. You can take whichever path you'd like, whether you use the 60 strength route or the 60 agility route. Both of them will lead you to the Wilderness God Wars dungeon. Now, the dungeon itself, the spiritual creatures are located in different parts of the dungeon. The Armadillo spiritual creatures are all in the northwest section, the Zamrock ones are all in the northeastern section, the Saradomin ones are all in the southwest area, and the Bandos creatures are all in the southeast section. The Armadillo ones in the northwest are all flying creatures, so you won't be able to use melee to kill them, so you should keep that in mind. Even though the gods are separated in different areas, they all follow the same rule for the protection required chart, which is, in order to make all of the monsters unaggressive to you in the dungeon, you have to wear a god item for each god, and it's not good enough just to have those god items in your inventory. You need to actually have those god items equipped on your character to render all of those monsters unaggressive. You'll also notice at the bottom right that the dungeon is in level 27 Wilderness, and these items here will allow you to teleport up to level 30 Wilderness, but do keep in mind, however, that the teleport block spell will prevent you from using any teleports for 5 minutes, or 2.5 minutes if a PKer uses that spell on you while you have the Protect from Magic prayer active. Also, it is in a multi-combat area, so keep that in mind and watch out for those teams of PKers. So those are the basic dungeon mechanics. We're now going to go back to the armor chart here, and like I mentioned, we need to create an armor setup that has 4 different god items incorporated into the setup. My strategy here would be to focus on choosing 3 expensive items in the best in slot. So some examples of really big items that I would focus on would be like a Slayer helmet, a really good weapon, and maybe a really good necklace or something in the shield slot. For newer players, the reason why you want to choose just 3 items is because of the death mechanics in the game, where if you get killed by another player, you keep your best 3 items as long as you're not skulled. For the more experienced players, you may want to consider bringing 4 items if you have the Protect item prayer active, but personally, I wouldn't even take the risk because the dungeon is in a multi-combat area, but it is up to you. The other thing to keep in mind for more experienced players is that you have to be careful with the wilderness weapons like the crossbow and the Vigora's chain mace. Although these items will speed up your Slayer task by a lot, these items also have a guaranteed loss of ether if a player kills you. I'm not going to go too in depth with the mechanics of these weapons, but generally speaking, I would put around 2 to 2.5k ether into my weapon, which is equivalent to about 500,000 coins a risk for using these weapons. Anyways, after choosing my big 3 items, I would then try to focus on all 4 god items in my armor setup, and like I said before in my protection required chart, you'll need a Saradomin, a Zamrock, a Bandos, and an Armadillo item. That's where the right side chart comes in handy. All of the green items represent items that are relatively cheap and easy to obtain in the game, meaning even if you were to get killed in the dungeon, most of these items aren't worth that much and you'll still keep your big 3 items. Alright, so you can pause the video to choose those items, but after choosing my big 3 items, making sure that my armor setup has all 4 gods incorporated, I would then focus on filling in those empty spots on my armor setup. And you don't have to fill these empty slots in if you don't want to, it's up to you to increase your efficiency, but do keep in mind that every extra item means you're risking more money. Personally, I would probably buy items that are in the best in slot section that are ranked in the double digits or at the very end. Those items are relatively cheap and you can pick and choose which ones you want to bring. So hopefully by now, you have an armor setup ready for the Wilderness God Wars dungeon. If you want to check your risk, you can click the Worn Equipment tab right next to the inventory button and click the backpack with the skull. This will show you what you're risking in the case where you do get killed by a PKer. If you're comfortable with the amount of risk you're bringing, then you're pretty much good to go, and keep in mind that I've done this Slayer task multiple times and I've never seen a PKer there, so take that information as you will. So we're on to the final section here, which is the location information. I've made timestamps for each location if you want to skip forward, but for each location, we will go over how to get to the dungeon, what your inventory and quick prayers will look like, and I'll also provide you with an example of how I would navigate the dungeon and how I would kill my desired spiritual creature. So we'll begin with the God Wars dungeon. The fastest way to get there is by teleporting to Trollheim. You can either use the spellbook at level 61 magic, or by creating yourself a tablet by using a scroll eye redirection on a house tab, but both of these can only be completed after you have finished the Edgar's Ruse quest. The next fastest way is to teleport yourself to the Troll Stronghold, either by using a Stony Basalt, or a troll stronghold portal inside a player-owned house. And just like the first option, you need to have had the making friends with my ARMOUR quest complete in order to use any of these options. The last option you have is to either use a combat bracelet to the Warriors Guild or a games necklace to Birth Orb, but if you use any of these methods, make sure to bring a pair of climbing boots with you. If it's your first time going to the God Wars dungeon, you want to bring a rope as well, and you may want to bring with you a stamina potion or a couple of energy potions because it is a far run. Lastly, you won't be able to use a cannon here, and there are save spots available, but the mechanics are a little bit strange, so I'll try to explain it better during the in-game example portion. And here are my inventory examples for each armor setup. You can copy it completely or alter it to your liking. Same goes with the quick pair settings. Here would be the settings that I would use for each armor setup, but feel free to change them to your liking. So here's the in-game example of how I would run to the dungeon and kill spiritual creatures. I've placed timestamps on the screen depending on which teleport you decide to use, so you can skip forward. So we'll begin with the Birth Orb and Warriors Guild area, and you can just follow along with me. So just follow the path northwest until you pass the cave and the wounded soldier. You can also drink a dose of your stamina potion if you have one. Once you see the wounded soldier, you can take the path northeast and just turn on your Protect from Missiles prayer. Once you pass the throwing trolls, you'll see some rocks right to the east. You can just wear your climbing boots and then climb up the rocks. You can also turn off your protection prayers for now, and once you're up the rocks, you can just follow the path north until you see the goat. So just climb over the rocks, and you want to take the path east. Once you get to the gate, you can turn on your Protect from Melee prayer and then run north to the next gate. Open up the gate and then you can run to the cave to the northwest. Once you're in here, you can run north to the next cave entrance. Once you're out, you can turn off your protection prayers and then run north. Once you start seeing the agility obstacles on your minimap, you can turn on your Protect from Missiles prayer and then run north. You can just run into the corridor and turn off your protection prayers, and then you can skip forward to the God Wars dungeon entrance in the timestamps. So here's how I would run to the God Wars dungeon from the top of Trollheim. You want to take the path directly east and climb down all of the rocks. Once you reach the bottom of the mountain, you'll want to turn on your Protect from Missiles prayer and run northwest. Just run into the corridor to the north, and you can also turn off your protection prayers. So we're at the agility obstacle now where we need 60 strength or 60 agility. Now is probably a good time to wear your god items that you have in your inventory before we enter the snowy area. I'll use the boulder that requires 60 strength, and if you take the agility crevice to the right, you should see your screen fade out to black for about a second, but both will lead you into the snowy area. Once you're past, you can turn on your melee prayer to protect yourself from the wolves. You can also see where the fire pit is if you complete the Making Friends with my ARM quest, which will stop your stats and run energy from being drained. And if this is your first time ever at the God Wars dungeon, make sure to speak to the Dying Knight northwest of the dungeon entrance. Go through the dialogue until you receive the Knight's notes. You can then drop the notes on the floor and then just use the rope on the hole to climb down into the main dungeon. And once you're down here, you can turn off your Protect from Melee prayer. For those of you who are using the Rune-like client, you can click the arrow button on the top right of the application to pull up the sidebar. You want to click the wrench to access the configuration settings. You can scroll down or type into the search bar NPC indicators. You want to switch on the plugin and also click the gear icon right next to it. And in the render style dropdown, make sure to have the highlight hull option ticked on. And where it says NPCs to highlight, type in the spiritual creature you're going to kill, whether it is the spiritual ranger, spiritual warrior, or the spiritual mage, and make sure to not make any spelling mistakes here. By doing this, it will highlight your spiritual creature in the rune-like client and allow you to see your spiritual creature you are going to kill a lot better. So we'll now go over all the best spots in the God Wars dungeon, and I've placed timestamps on the screen so you can skip forward to your area. The first best spot I'll go over is the main dungeon. I use the southeast section, but before I attack them, what you can do is drink your stat boosting potions, activate your quick prayers, have your auto retaliate on, and you can just go ahead and attack them. And it's pretty simple and there's not much to it. You can just attack them normally, or you can use the piles of bricks on the floor to safe spot them, but you'll also find that they lose aggression onto you when you do this method of safe spotting them, and they may walk away sometimes, so you just have to keep moving around the bricks every so often. The second spot we'll go over is the Bando Stronghold, and we'll run northwest from the main entrance. You'll find a big door, and as long as you have the hammer in your inventory, you should be able to open the door as long as you also have 70 strength. Once you're in here, you can put on your best in slot armor again because we're now out of the main dungeon. I use the north section in this room, and before you attack them, what you can do is drink your stat boosting potions, activate your quick prayers, have your auto retaliate on, and you just go ahead and attack them. You can just attack them normally, or you can use the piles of bricks on the floor to safe spot them, but you'll also find that they lose aggression onto you when you do this method of safe spotting them, and they may walk away sometimes, so you just have to keep moving around the bricks every so often. The third spot we'll go over is the Zamorak's Fortress, and we'll run directly north from the main entrance. You'll see a small bridge, just click the climb off ice bridge and you'll cross into the Zamorak area. Once you cross the icy bridge, you'll see that your prayer points will drain to 0, and that's perfectly alright, just drink your prayer potion to restore your prayer points. Once you're in the Zamorak area, you can put on your best in slot armor again because we're now out of the main dungeon. I use the east section, and before you attack them, you can drink your stat boosting potions, activate your quick prayers, have your auto retaliate on, and you just go ahead and attack them. We're now moving on to the Wilderness God Wars dungeon, and the fastest way to get here is by using a Wilderness Obelisk inside a player-owned house and setting the destination to level 27 Wilderness. Personally, I would only use this option if I have completed the hard Wilderness Diary, which allows you to set your destination. The next fastest way is by teleporting to the cemetery. You can buy a tablet from the Grand Exchange and use it with no requirements, or you can also make one with 71 magic, 100% Arceus favor, along with 1 law, soul, blood, and a dark essence block on the lectern at the auditor's house. You can also use the teleport in the Arceus spellbook with level 71 magic, whilst also having 60% Arceus favor. The third option is to use a Dariac teleport. You can only use this teleport after you have completed the Desert Treasure quest, and you can either buy a tablet from the Grand Exchange or by using the Ancient Magic spellbook at level 78 magic. The fourth option is to use a Burning Amulet, and this amulet has no requirements to use. You can either buy it from the Grand Exchange, or you can make one by using the level 3 enchant spell on a Topaz Amulet. And the last option is to use a Ring of Dueling to the Ferox Enclave. This ring has no requirements to use, and you can either buy it from the Grand Exchange, or you can make one by using the level 2 enchant spell on an Emerald Ring. When you teleport to the Ferox Enclave, it is in a safe zone, so you just have to pass one of the barriers to exit into the wilderness. Lastly, you won't be able to use a cannon here, and there aren't any safe spots available. And here are my inventory examples for each armor setup. You can copy it completely or alter it to your liking. Same goes with the quick prayer settings. Here would be the settings that I would use for each armor setup, but feel free to change them to your liking. So this part is specifically for the people who are using the Rune-like client, but before we go to the Wilderness Dungeon, what we can do is click the arrow button on the top right of the application to pull up the sidebar. You want to click the wrench to access the configuration settings. You can scroll down or type into the search bar NPC indicators. You want to switch on the plugin and also click the gear icon right next to it. And in the render style dropdown, make sure to have the highlight hull option ticked on. And where it says NPCs to highlight, type in the spiritual creature you're going to kill, whether it is the spiritual ranger, spiritual warrior, or the spiritual mage, and make sure to not make any spelling mistakes here. By doing this, it will highlight your spiritual creature in the Rune-like client and allow you to see your spiritual creature you are going to kill a lot better. Anyways, I'm right outside the Wilderness God Wars dungeon cave entrance, and once you're here, you can enter into the cave. And like I mentioned before, we're now in the lobby area. The path south will lead to the 60 agility obstacle, and the path west the 60 strength one, so I'll just take the path west since most of you guys will probably use this shortcut, but it really doesn't matter because both sides will lead right into the dungeon anyways. Just use the crevice to go through, and once you're in here, you can run southwest into the Saradomin room. And it's very simple once you come down here. You can drink a dose of your stat boosting potions, activate your quick prayers, have your auto retaliate on, and you can just go ahead and attack your spiritual creature. Obviously, just be on high alert and watch out for those peak hairs. You can look for white dots on the minimap, and you can also have your armor tab open and have your level 30 wilderness teleport ready in case you do see anyone. Anyways guys, I'm going to end the guide here. If this video has helped you out and you want to help me out as well, I greatly appreciate it if you could leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel. And if you're doing more Slayer guides, make sure to check out my other Slayer guides in the description box below. But that's about it. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Later.